So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me introduce myself. My name is Alfredo D'Angelo, and I work at Catholic University of the Sacré-Cœur of Milan as an associate professor. And I moved there 4 years ago, Glasgow, at University of Glasgow, the Adam Smith Business School, and there is actually one of my co-authors Trevor is still active in Glasgow. The paper I'm going to present has recently been business review, and as I said earlier, refers to this concept of early exporting, the earliness of exporting and creeping sclerosis. Now, the term sclerosis comes from medicine and usually refers to the veins of your body getting harder as you get older, as we get fatter, as you have a bigger structure. And this is essentially the kind of parallel we made between the medicine and this particular topic. Now, I've put there a link to the article. You can have a free access for 50 days, so you can, perhaps you also have my full article, you can maybe spread around and to the others. Now, let's do let's get a step back, and starting with internationalization, which usually subject to mainly two liabilities. The first one is the liability of foreigners. In other words, when firms go abroad, they do have greater costs they have to support compared to local firms. This puts local firms in a greater advantage compared to firms who wants to move from one country to another country. Talking about small firm, the other liability which usually we consider is the company made of a few people with few financial resources, few human resources, and so forth. Those two elements together favor a gradual approach towards internationalization. In other words, a firm based on the Uppsala model should concentrate first to develop their business within the country, to consolidate their business, and then afterwards gradually enter different markets at a different time, and also perhaps not that geographically distant or too different from a psychological distance point of view. So this is what the theory says. The theory says on a gradual basis, given the liabilities of foreigners, given the liability of smallness. However, the reality of things has some way left us with a number of firms, particularly from the high-tech industry, who are capable of going abroad immediately. In literature, they say since inception, since their foundation. The literature calls them born global or international new ventures. And around these two labels, has been developed the entire, basically the attention is to the characteristics of the entrepreneur and his abilities and perhaps even his prior experience. Okay, this prior experience is the element which falls under the label of learning advantage of newness. The ability of internationalize early comes from the experience and the knowledge that the entrepreneur has acquired through previous experience prior the foundation of the company. Now, based on the experience, based on the network they have developed earlier on, they are capable of establishing a firm, a new firm, who is able to enter into foreign markets relatively quickly, usually within a short period of time since their foundation, based on the competencies, resources, networks. This concept, theoretically speaking, falls under the label of learning advantages, which are related to the individual entrepreneur. Okay. Now, those young firms have, according to the theory, have advantages. Different type of advantages. First of all, structural type of advantages compared to established firm. There are no routines there. The firm is young, is made of few people. Very little routines are there. There are very little hierarchical structure to consider. And also the firm is less embedded within local ties. In other words, those young firms that perhaps take advantage of the prior learning, the prior networks, are capable of going abroad given these three advantages linked to the notion of learning. Advantages are structural, cognitive, and positional, in the way I just mentioned. From a structural perspective, the company has very little routines compared to existing firms. From a cognitive perspective, the firm is less specialized and less rooted in structure. From a positional perspective, there are very little and few embedded ties with domestic clients, domestic partners. Now, based on this theory, even small firm, young firm, are capable of internationalizing early, given the learning advantage, thanks to the learning advantage of newness. Okay. Now, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Is internationalizing early good for a company, or is something, the general theory, the Uppsala model, says before you go abroad, try to have big shoulders. Try to consolidate your market first and then you go abroad. So going abroad early in your lifetime is going to put your business at risk. Well, according to some case, the survival of early internationalizing firms, the survival rate is lower. They tend to die, they internationalize young, but they die young. Okay. However, some other theorists will tell you going first abroad should give you a first mover advantage. Otherwise, it's useless what we go out there and teach to our students to reach a market first. So there must be some level of knowledge where we still have to figure out if what is actually true. And this is essentially the topic of the research. The broad research aim of the does this LAN concept around which firms build their early internationalization last over time, or it is subject to a number of conditions or contingent factors? In other words, if I internationalize, let's say, very early in the lifetime, I established my firm in 1977, and I'm 80 after 3 years since inception. I'm an early internationalizer. Okay. Now, does this characteristic, which should theoretically refer to the learning advantage of newness, last over time, I'm capable of finding traces after a long period of time, or do I lose the advantage I had initially? Please, if you do have questions, interrupt me, ask questions for clarifications. So this was the main research aim. Does the LAN concept last over time, or is subject to contingencies? In other words, as I said, does the early exporting have consequences, positive consequences, for post-entry export performance? As the firm mature, as the firm get bigger, does this have an effect on the relationship between earliness of exporting and performance? As the firm establish an hierarchical decision-making structure, is this going to have an effect? Now, in pictures. So the table here, what we are measuring here is essentially, okay, this is the concept of earliness. I'm going to tell you how we measure it in a minute. Okay, let's say this concept. Okay, let's say this concept of earliness comes as in reference to how fast you are in going abroad. Okay, how early you enter since you establish your firm. Okay, so therefore you establish in 1980. Okay, I'm already anticipating you the measure, how we made it. You do 100 minus the difference, gives you a number which is 97. Okay, so this is your speed. Now, if you are established in 1977, but you in 1983, after 6 years, you do 100 minus 6 is 94. You are less early in the internationalization process. Okay, and what we want to measure is, okay, well, given that earliness is on the individual entrepreneur advantage, okay, given this good thing, are we capable of maintaining over time this relationship? My ability to internationalize early lasts long. This is what we are trying to measure. What are the effects on this relationship as the firm gets old, older, and as the firm gets bigger? What are the effects of having a centralized decision-making structure on these two relations? The paper has been developed in the form of hypotheses, which I'm not going to go through. They are essentially what I just mentioned, the relationship between the concept of earliness and post-entry performance. Then the moderating effect of having a centralized decision-making structure. This is the theory. So the theory, this is what it tells us. There must be some key elements that make firms able to go international early. Now, this data come from, these are secondary data, which I did not collect myself. They come from Assolombarda, which is an association of Italian firms spread all around, well, these are spread around Lombardia, which is the region where Milan is, let's call it the capital, and Assolombarda is part of Confindustria, which is the association of Italian enterprises. They build this data set on the basis of an original data set called effet, which was built by the European Commission. And so they managed to extract a sample of firms from the big data set collected at European level, 5 most innovative regions in Europe. Therefore, from Lombardia, from Catalonia, from Baden-Württemberg, from Germany, and from Rhone Alps. And you can see on the third bullet point, this is the sample Alps. And you can see on the third bullet point, this is the sample, 644 companies with more than 10 employees, 4 countries, 5 regions. I'm going to tell you later the average of number of employees and so forth, but you will see that, give you the measure, they follow under the label of small firms, small and medium-sized firms. The data are related to the high-tech, the 4 different level of technology within the manufacturing industry, and dealing with different countries, of course, refers to different social, cultural, political contexts around Europe. Now, the measure. The dependent variable, which is the variable we are going to measure in 2014, is the export performance, okay? Which is essentially a ratio of foreign sales to total sales. Classic measure. The independent variable, the earliness of exporting, is essentially what I just tried to explain earlier, and essentially refers to how early a firm enters its first international market. Based on the concept that firms that enter into international markets have something extra. This is what we know, or what we suppose they have. Why they enter into international market early? Because they have some advantage, that we call it learning advantage of newness. Based on the less cognitive structure and so forth. Based on previous experience of the entrepreneur, previous established networks, less ties with domestic environment. Advantage in going abroad early, and from this firm perspective, okay? Then we go and look at the effect of moderating variables. Size, the number of employees. What happens to this relationship as the firm gets bigger? What is the size of this relationship as the age, as the firm gets older? Remember the idea of sclerosis. As we get older, as we get bigger, as we have a stronger structure, perhaps this effect is going to change. This is what we suppose. We don't know. We are going there trying to measure it. And for the centralized decision-making structure, here the variable were questionnaires. Okay. Now, the CEO who responded the questionnaire told us, do you have a vertical decision-making structure where the CEO takes all the decision, or within your company, managers? And this says us yes or no. Okay, there are problems there in relation to these dummy variables, which is a limitation for sure of this study. From a methodological perspective, here we didn't go too much fancy. We used the straight in order to test the relationship between those two variables, trying to establish some causal relationship, because the earliness of exporting is a concept that was measured in relation to many years ago. Compared to the measure of export performance. The measure of export performance, how much of your sales come from abroad, is a question that you answer in 2000. Measure of earliness is related to back in time, in relation to how old you were when you first internationalized. So there might be, the causal relationship is one way. It cannot be the other way around, right? So as I said, we didn't go fancy with the methodology. We lagged the variables size, age, and centralization, but essentially the causal relationship was inside the way we measure the variables from the very beginning. We did all the calculation, the variance inflation factor. We mean-centered the variables before to do the interaction terms and so forth. And we also ran Tobit regression as a robustness check to see if the results from OLS were substantial. And also we had to deal with some selection bias, which I'm going to tell you more in a minute. Now, these are essentially the results. Now, in the first model, we only introduced the variable size and age. So the model I want you to look at is perhaps model 2. What we wanted to test first is to internationalize early and ex post performance. Well, it seems so. It seems there is a positive relationship here, significant. Okay, so it seems that firms that internationalize early are capable of maintaining their advantage that comes wherever you want it comes. We don't have control over that. It comes from previous experience of the entrepreneur. It comes from his perhaps industry, okay, development. We don't know. We don't have control over that. The only thing we can say is that essentially there seems to be a positive relationship between how fast you internationalize many years after. So you are capable of keeping this LAN, this learning advantage of newness. Okay? However, what happens as you get older and as you get bigger? And this is essentially what we found. As you get older, as you get bigger, your learning advantage of newness decreases. So you lose gradually your advantage as you get bigger, and as you get larger. But why? Essentially, the concept of learning advantage of newness that we have used to describe the ability of the entrepreneur, basis of his previous knowledge, his previous experience, his network, during years, he becomes older. Things change. As the firm becomes bigger, the firms start to develop ties and start to develop perhaps structures which go against your ability to keep your the concept of learning advantage of newness refers to the entrepreneur. As the entrepreneur and therefore the firm becomes older, you lose that initial advantage. As the firm becomes bigger, you lose that advantage because you start to introduce layer inside your decision-making model, or perhaps you start to have a structure in the organization. Now, if this is true, what happens if you do actually have a formalized structure? This is what we try to also check. So the earliness is related to post-entry performance. As you get older, you lose. As you get bigger, you lose that advantage. Now, if we divide using that variable, that measure, is the CEO taking all the decision or the decisions are taken by employees? We split the sample. So we move from the sample. So we move from 390 observation to a division 290 and 100. So these 290 firms, they actually they responded, yes, our CEO. And what happens here? These effects of size and age are confirmed within firms that adopted a centralized decision-making structure.
Say that again, sir. Say that again, sir.
Remember what we measured in the first time?
Yes.
The first time, what we said, age has a negative effect on the relationship between earliness and post-entry export. Size has a negative effect. Here is if a company has a centralized decision-making structure, let's say if a company is family-owned, okay, is this a negative effect of size and age are still there? Are they perhaps driven by
the fact that it is centralized? Yeah.
And then the results are those ones. Yes, they are confirmed. Where firms have a centralized decision-making structure, they lose the learning advantage of newness as they get older and as they get bigger. In order to prove that, we ran a robustness check by considering family firms. This is the example. Usually the family CEO takes all the decision. Now, is this confirmed within this kind of firm? Now, the definition of family firm is a little bit complicated, it's a little bit tricky. Now, we use the definition essentially is self-declare when answer your questionnaire. Says, are you a family firm? Yes. And then we checked, is this family firm with a family CEO? Yes. Okay, so that's our definition, and the results, as you can see, are still there, confirming that if you do have a centralized decision-making structure, like in most of the family firms, as you get older, you lose the learning advantage of newness that allowed you to internationalize early. Of course, as you have seen, the sample is made of 644 companies, but we ran the results only on 390 firms. In other words, there are within our sample firms which were not included in the equation. And someone could say there are reasons why those firms have not been inserted. There are reasons why these firms have not. So you should control for those kind of reasons, because otherwise your sample will be biased. It was, well, okay, let's take all our variables and let's insert one variable which is related to the probability of exporting, but is unrelated to the performance. Now, one variable that is related to the probability of exporting is being or not being a family firm. Usually, family firms are less international inclined. Okay? However, being a family firm does not affect. Within even a family firm is the presence perhaps of a niche strategy, or perhaps the presence of external managers. The fact that you are a family firm itself is not negative or bad for performance. It can be negative for the probability of exporting, but not necessarily for the performance later. This is what we believe, this is what we have been told. We ran the two models, the first step and the second step. That was insignificant, so our model, where we included only early exporters, was not subject to selection bias. Now, just to conclude, we confirm this positive relationship between the LAN theoretical concept and the post-entry export performance. We obtained this confirmation in a sample of firms from different European countries. This positive relationship is negatively moderated by the liabilities of age and liabilities of size. Okay. On top of the liability of age and liability of size, we confirm a third liability, which is the liability of as an effect on the previous same liability. The contribution. The earlier you internationalize, the better is. So it seems to count the concept, of an early mover advantage, which we got from great scholars. So the faster you get into the market, the better is, and you are capable of keeping. However, as you get older, as you get bigger, you lose that advantage, particularly if you have a centralized decision-making structure. At the third liability of centralization. Essentially, what we are saying here is, look, if you are a firm established by a clever entrepreneur with a very strong network, a very good prior experience, you are capable of leveraging over those capabilities, and therefore you are capable of internationalizing early. Okay? Now, you are likely to maintain this effect and this advantage over your rivalries over time. However, as you get bigger and as you get older, you might risk to lose that advantage. If you do have a centralized decision-making structure, in other words, if you are a family firm, you are more likely to lose it, to have this negative effect of age, and size. In other words, you are in risk of an heart attack. Going back to the parallel we made earlier, if your veins start to harden, you get sclerosis. Of course, there are pros and cons of these, there are limitations, point of strengths, as any piece of research. The first, let's call it limitation, is that unfortunately we cannot measure what were the variables before the 1977. We don't know anything about this individual. We don't know his level of education, we don't know his network, we don't know his experience. Essentially, I've made these up from theory. The theory is what tells us that, if you internationalize early, it's because you have some sort of advantage coming from your experience. But unfortunately, we did not control for it. We didn't have information back in 1977, for example. We use a dummy variable. Do you have a centralized decision-making structure? You are a CEO taking all the decision or not? Well, this is a 0-1 variable. We know that the decision-making happens in different ways. There are better measures to consider all the nuances of decision-making. However, beyond those limitations, we believe that we have international entrepreneurship literature supporting the idea that LAN is not path dependent. So because you have these, nice jacket that comes from your previous experience and so forth, does mean that this jacket is going to last your previous experience and so forth. Does mean that this jacket is going to last forever, and it's not path dependent, and does not stays with you, because there are conditions and there are liabilities that might. So it's not path dependent, but it's subject to boundary conditions or contingencies. Of course, there are other contingencies there, internally to the firm as well as externally to the firm, that could be definitely. I hope it was not that boring. Thank you very much.